Thank you for joining us for this MDA Engaged community webinar. My name is Michelle Barrios, and I am the Community Education Specialist at MDA. We are thrilled to have you join us today for this important and educational webinar. This webinar today is part of our larger MDA Engaged flagship, Community, which focuses on bringing the neuromuscular disease community together around education and social opportunities. Be sure to visit the MDA Engage section on mda.org for updates on upcoming virtual education events. We are recording today's event and will be posting it to the mda.org website for on-demand viewing to ensure that those who are not able to join us live today are able to access this information. Please know that all phone lines have been muted. We will be having a question and answer session towards the end of the webinar. Please be sure to utilize the chat window to type in your questions. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, a tray of webinar icons will appear. Click on the chat bubble to open the chat and enter your question. You do not need to wait until the Q&A session to chat in your questions. As questions come up along the webinar, please feel free to send those in. Before we begin, I would like to say thank you to our speakers, whom you will meet shortly. Also, thank you to our event supporters, Biogen and Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America. We would not be able to provide events like this if not for their generous support. So thank you very much. Next slide. The Muscular Dystrophy Association is committed to transforming the lives of people affected by muscular dystrophy, ALS, and related neuromuscular diseases. We do this through our innovations in care and innovations in science. MDA's reach with research is vast. MDA is the largest non-governmental funder of neuromuscular research in the country. To share a little bit specifically to the MDA's work in the ALS research landscape, MDA has spent more than $3 million on ALS grants in 2019. The total number of ALS grants active at any time in 2019 was 60. MDA invested more than $18 million on ALS grants in the last 5 years. Since inception, MDA has invested more than $168 million in ALS research. Next slide. With that foundation, let us review the objectives for today's webinar. Participants will discuss clinical trial participation in ALS patients, learn how to find out about ALS clinical trials, learn how to get involved in ALS clinical trials advocacy initiatives, and listen to firsthand clinical trial experience of a person living with ALS. Now, I would like to introduce our first two speakers. Sabrina Paganoni, MD, PhD, is a physician investigator at the HEALEY Center for ALS at Massachusetts General, co-director of the Neurological Research Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital and Rehabilitation at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Paganoni obtained her MD degree at the University of Milan in Italy and a PhD in neuroscience at Northwestern University. Dr. Paganoni's research focuses on clinical trials and therapy development for ALS. She has served as the principal investigator of many ALS clinical trials and has been using novel neuroimaging techniques, biofluid biomarkers, and digital technology as measures of target engagement in these trials. Currently, she is the co-principal investigator of the HEALEY ALS platform trial. Her research has been funded by the NIH, several ALS foundations and nonprofits, and industry. She is also passionate about clinical care innovation and access to research. She co-chairs the Upper Motor Neuron Task Force, the Technology Committee, and the Recruitment Retention Experience Committee at NEALS. She is working with other Harvard researchers on developing new shoulder and hand assistive technology devices that can improve function and quality of life for people with ALS. Judy Carey is a research access nurse at the HEALEY Center for ALS at Massachusetts General Hospital. She has 13 years of nursing experience and over 3 years in her current position at Massachusetts General Hospital. Judy helps to provide hope by sharing information about ALS research with thousands of people living with ALS and their loved ones via phone and email. She also assists in educating people about ALS trials at Massachusetts General Hospital and helps connect them with appropriate trials for participation. Judy is a member of the following committees at MGH: Recruitment and Retention for NEALS and the HEALEY Platform Trial, Onboarding of Neurology Nurses, and New Clinic Patient Communications. Next slide. And with that, I would like to turn the webinar over to Dr. Pagadoni.
Thank you, Michelle, and thanks everyone for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here and to provide you with an update on ALS clinical trials. I will also mention the HEALEY ALS platform trial, which is a trial where we're currently working on. So to just give you some background about the landscape, we've been doing ALS clinical trials for about 25 years. And there's been some successes, including the publication and development and marketing of Riluzole, Nuedexta, and Edaravone. These are the 3 drugs that are approved for ALS at this time. Riluzole and Edaravone are approved for disease modification, and Nuedexta is used to treat some of the symptoms of ALS. And throughout all of this, I had to say that really the development of these drugs has really been supported by a very active and collaborative research community. So the first point I want to make today is that the scientific community in ALS is really active, really collaborative, and really trying to think outside the box to develop new treatments for people with ALS and for their families. And the projects listed at the top here, I'm not going to describe them in detail, but this is just to say that there's a number of national and international initiatives that have been developed since the 90s to really try to learn more about ALS, about its mechanisms, about the genetics of the disease, about disease targets. And all of this is very important because it's only because of the work of the scientists in the lab and the clinical research experts that we can really develop new drugs in addition to the 3 that have already been developed. And so for this, it's really exciting to see that the field of ALS clinical trials has been pioneering new techniques, including antisense oligonucleotide technology, other types of gene modification techniques, as well as innovative clinical trial methodologies that continue to evolve. So all of this is very important. The development of new drugs really starts in the lab with solid preclinical science and bench research, and then it continues through a spectrum of research, including clinical research, clinical trials, and a lot of collaborative work. So I think that while we only have 3 drugs for ALS at this time, I'm really hopeful that the next few months and years will bring about many new compounds. And what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes is to basically summarize where we are, describe a few trials that are ongoing, and kind of give you a sense of clinical trial opportunities that are out there for people to participate if they're interested in participating. Next slide. So first of all, I want to talk about familial ALS. As you may know, the vast majority of people with ALS do not have a family history of the disease. However, about 10% of people with ALS do have other family members with the same disease. And even if they don't have anyone with ALS in their immediate family, there's also people who may carry a genetic mutation or a gene that can cause the disease. That's known as familial ALS or genetically determined ALS. if that's the case, then we're talking of very specific populations, very specific groups of patients that carry a distinct, a unique DNA signature. And so what has happened over the last few years is that there's been an explosion in genomics, genetics, and gene silencing trials. And those are specifically targeting people with genetic forms of the disease. On the slide here, you can see on the left that the SOD1 gene that causes ALS, the first gene to be discovered as a causative gene for ALS, was discovered in 1993. That was actually discovered at the Massachusetts General Hospital by Dr. Brown. And that was really monumental discovery that happened a few years ago. That was the first demonstration that, again, there's a gene that we can identify and that we can work on, and that causes a small percentage of cases of ALS. Now, the good news is that because of the gene discovery that was done at the time, there's been a lot of research into ways to silence or downregulate, basically to stop that gene from causing ALS. There's been really 10 years now of gene silencing trials. And just a few days ago, there were two major publications in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the most prestigious journal in medicine, and two publications that showed that two different groups have been successful in preliminary studies in turning off these genes using different techniques. So specifically, there was a phase 1-2 trial of antisense oligonucleotides targeting the SOD1 gene in ALS that was published, that was sponsored by Biogen. And then the other paper was an SOD1 suppression trial using a virus, a gene therapy virus that was led by Dr. Brown, who's actually the scientist who discovered the gene many years ago. So what's exciting is that now, over the span of the last few years, we've gone from gene identification to actually developing tools, whether it's an antisense oligonucleotide technique or a viral mediated gene therapy, to turn off and downregulate these genes. And that's important because that's the first time that researchers have shown that you can actually intervene on these genes. Now, these are still early trials, so they're not necessarily a medication yet that can be given to a large group of people, but it's definitely promising to see that there are clinical trials in this space, so specifically for the SOD1 gene. And then the hope is that with ongoing trials that are actually available now, for example, the larger phase 3 trial for antisense oligonucleotide treatments for SOD1, also sponsored by Biogen, the hope is that, by giving this drug to a larger group of people and following them over time, the hope is that there might also be a therapeutic effect. Obviously, the trial is still ongoing, so we need to see the results, but that's definitely a very promising line of research. Next slide. So the good news is that this is not just for SOD1. There's been significant breakthroughs in genetics over the last few years. And the graph at the bottom basically shows gene discovery over the last 20 years. And as you can see there, gene count continues to double every 4 years with respect to our knowledge of ALS genes. So what that means is that now we're discovering more genes that cause ALS, not just SOD1. And what's very important is that the same technological tools, so for example, antisense oligonucleotides or gene therapy techniques that are being developed for SOD1 or also for other genes in other areas of medicine, are now being used also to turn off other ALS genes. And so once again, this is just still preliminary evidence. We don't have the final drugs for these cases of familial ALS, but certainly there is a lot of progress. And so for people who have familial ALS or genetically determined ALS, it's certainly worth considering learning more about trials that specifically target that population. Next slide. Well, obviously you may ask, well, that's okay for people that have familial ALS. That's only 10% of the population. What happens to the 90% of people with ALS that do not have a gene? So if people with ALS do not have a gene, obviously they would not be candidate necessarily for those type of genetic intervention. However, we have many more targets for intervention. And the graph here, I'm not going to describe that in detail, but that's just a schematic to show that for people that don't necessarily have a gene that causes ALS. So in the cases of so-called sporadic ALS, we still have many different targets for intervention. So all the science, all the collaboration between scientists in the basic labs has really led to a better understanding of the different mechanisms that cause ALS. So now we know, as discussed and described on the slide in the picture there, that there are many different parts of the cell, the nerve cell, that can be affected by ALS. And why is this important? Well, that's important because if you know what goes wrong, you know where to go to fix it. And so essentially, by identifying these different things that can go wrong in the cell of a person with ALS, then we can have different shots at trying to fix it. So now different companies and different investigators around the world are trying to identify different drugs that can fix each one of the different spots that are highlighted here on the slide. And so they're trying to fix inflammation, they're trying to fix energy production, they're trying to fix different parts of the cell that can be affected by ALS. And that can be applicable to the more sporadic population, again, the majority of people with ALS. Next slide. So much so that now ALS is the neuromuscular disease with the largest drug development pipeline. The graph actually comes from an IQVIA Institute report that was actually sponsored by the Muscular Dystrophy Association in 2018. And so at the time, as you can see in the graph, and the arrow points to ALS, compared to all other neuromuscular diseases such as muscular dystrophy or other diseases, was actually the disease that had the most clinical trials available and the most drugs in development. And actually the numbers have even increased since then. Over the last 2 years, we've seen an even larger increase in the development of new drugs for ALS. So in 2018, the IQVIA Institute counted almost 60 drugs in development for ALS. And I can tell you that based on our recent count, we now know that we have almost 160 drugs. So a lot of shots on goal, a lot of different targets, a lot of different companies and investigators around the world, all trying to develop new treatments for ALS. Now, some of these drugs are in early development. So what that means is that they're not available for clinical trials in people yet. But certainly, it's great news to know that there's almost 160 drugs in development for ALS at different stages around the world. And that means that as new knowledge is accumulated about these drugs, then more of them can actually move forward and then go into humans, into people with ALS for clinical trial testing. Next slide. So at this time, we have many clinical trials all around the world targeting different parts of the cell, different mechanisms. So they might target inflammation, and those are the immunomodulatory trials. They may target specific genes, as I discussed earlier, gene therapy trials, antisense oligonucleotides trials. They might target neuronal excitability, so when the nerve cells are too excitable, there are drugs to try to correct that. There are stem cells that are being tried for ALS of different kinds, again, different trials. And there's also many other mechanisms. As I showed earlier, there's many targets in the cell. There's many new targets that we're learning about that we can leverage as things that we can fix in the cell. And so the list here is really a partial list. It's only a few of the drugs that are in development. I told you before, there's over almost 160 drugs. I'm not listing them all here. Some are in early trials, some are still in the lab. But what I'm showing on the slide are some of the drugs that are now in later stages development. So what that means is that once you study these drugs in the lab, then you go on and do clinical trials, first in small groups of people, that's a phase 1 trial, then in a more intermediate size group, that's the phase 2 trial, and then in a larger group of people, such as in a phase 3 trial, where you're really trying to determine finally whether the drug is effective at slowing down or stopping the disease. And I bolded some of them. I'm sorry, if you can go back one slide. I bolded some of these names because they are the ones in phase 3 trials or in other late stages trials. And so some of them are still ongoing. Some are about to finish. Some recently completed, like the AMX35 trial was recently completed, and we should know the results soon. Other trials, such as the arimoclomol or levosimendan trials, should be completed over the next few months. Other trials, such as the Brainstorm trial, should be completed over the next few months. And other trials that are listed here are about to start or just started in late stages for ALS. So again, the more trials, the more opportunities to try to find a treatment. So I think it's good news for the ALS community that there are many people doing research on ALS all around the world. Next slide. I also want to share that thanks to the support of many different groups, including the MDA, and because of the work of many people in different academic centers in the US, we have a large clinical trial network called MEALS. That's a clinical trial network of basically hospitals or academic institutions where clinical trials can happen in an efficient way for people with ALS. So these are all centers that have been working on ALS clinical trials for the last 25 years or more, and they're all connected as a network so that clinical trials can be done efficiently for ALS, because the investigators, the nurses, the doctors, the coordinators have experience with ALS. And so this is a way to make the process more efficient. Next slide. So the question though is, running these trials is still expensive and it still takes a long time. So as a network, a couple of years ago, we said, okay, in addition to running all these individual trials where we test one drug at a time, can we try to design a more efficient process where we can actually test multiple drugs at the same time to accelerate the clinical trial landscape? And so we really learned from our colleagues from cancer, from oncology, that there are models and innovative clinical trial designs where you can really cut down the time it takes to develop treatments for a disease, in cancer, for example, by over 50%. And you can also do that in a cost-effective manner. So when we learned that from cancer, these are new trial designs that have been developed over the last few years in other areas of medicine, we said, okay, can we bring that to ALS? And that's how the concept of the platform trial came about. Next slide. So in a traditional trial, we test each one of the previous drugs I discussed earlier, one at a time as individual trials. But when you build a platform trial for the community, you can then test, using the same infrastructure or the same arena, you can test multiple interventions, multiple treatments in parallel and sequentially. So essentially, you build an infrastructure or a network of sites that can do the research using the same protocol, the same processes. And you can leverage that to test multiple treatments to make the process more efficient. And so obviously, you will always have traditional trials, but we also wanted to build, in addition to those, a platform trial that the academic community could leverage to expedite the time it takes to develop new treatments for ALS. Next. So that's what we've been working on for the last year or so. We really wanted to bring together the academic community to launch the very first platform trial for ALS in the world, which is something that's about to take off, and that's known as the HEALEY ALS platform trial. Now, this is not the only trial for ALS. So again, as I said earlier, there are many other trials, some in early stages and some in late stages. And that's great that we have multiple trials, but I want to now focus on what we are leading with the NILS consortium with the support of the Healy Center for ALS Mass General, as another trial that we're launching now that we think is really going to be transformative, because it's going to allow us to test even more drugs for ALS. And by doing so in a more efficient manner, we can accelerate the timelines to the first effective treatments. Next. So the HEALEY ALS platform trial offers several benefits over traditional trial. I'm going to summarize that now. Again, as I said earlier, because we're testing multiple drugs using the same infrastructure, it's more time effective and cost effective. And also, another key feature of our design is that by using a shared infrastructure or a common protocol, we can learn more from the same trial, more information than we could normally. And most importantly, we reduce the number of people on placebo. Now, you may be familiar with the concept of placebo, where in a given trial, some people are given the actual drug, the active drug, and some people are given placebo, which is an inactive or non-real drug as a comparator. Now here in the platform trial, because we are testing multiple drugs at the same time, we only need essentially one small placebo group that we can use as a comparator to all the other drugs. And by doing that, we reduce significantly the number of people who are on placebo, or we could also say the flip side is we increase significantly the number of people that are on active. And so that's really a patient-centered approach where we can offer more access to the active treatment than we could normally do in a traditional trial. Next slide. So for now, as we launch the trial this summer, we're going to test 3 drugs in parallel, and those are zilucoplan, verdiperstat, and CNM-Au8. Now we're also working on adding the 4th treatment called predopidine very soon in the fall, and we are also adding other treatments in 2021. So essentially, again, we're launching the trial now as a more efficient way of testing more drugs for ALS, because as I said earlier, there are multiple targets for intervention. There are multiple drugs that are in development, and we really want to do our best to try to test as many drugs as possible, as quickly as possible, so that we can provide answers to people with ALS. Next slide. So to summarize, the platform trial can accelerate the path to effective treatments for ALS. There's actually strong support for this approach, and the trial is going to be perpetual. So essentially, we're going to keep this open and keep testing new drugs until we can find one or more that are effective for all people with ALS. Next slide. So here is a couple of slides just to give you a sense of how to connect with the research community. So on this slide, you can see the contact information for the platform trial, patient navigator, with a phone number and an email. And we also have a newsletter that actually Judy Carey, who's the next speaker, manages to send out information to the community, not only about this trial, but about other research opportunities as well. Next slide. And also for this trial and all the other ALS trials, you can always visit the website of NILS and also clinicaltrials.gov and look for ALS trials specifically. The next speakers will talk about how to really connect and really participate in trials, but I hope that this was an overview of what's available, and I hope that again the key message is clear, that there is a lot of interest from the scientific community in continuing to develop new treatments for people with ALS. There's many trials that are either open right now or about to open, and we certainly hope that as many people as possible can participate, so that together we can make progress and develop new treatments. And I'll be happy to take questions, I think, at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paganani. I would now like to move to our next speaker, Judy Carey. Judy?
Here I am. I'm coming. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me here today to talk to you about ALS research. I am the research access nurse at Mass General Hospital in the HEALEY Center for ALS Research and in the MGH ALS Multidisciplinary Care Clinic, which is an MDA care center. So our entire multidisciplinary clinic is set up so that patients receive both clinical care and the opportunity to learn about and participate in ALS trials that are conducted at our center. Everyone on the multidisciplinary team has knowledge to talk with patients about these trials. My primary responsibility is to provide the details of trials to hundreds of people, both patients and non-patients of MGH, to educate them about the research process and to help figure out what trials they may be eligible for at our center. So I do this in person, by phone, email, and now Zoom calls. So while most of the people I communicate with will not likely participate in trials, it's always time well spent educating people with ALS about research. It is so important to everyone living with this disease to know that research is happening on your behalf. Why? Because research holds the hope for all people living with ALS. Our MDA Care Center integrates both clinical care and research, which is convenient and helpful for our patients. Many other MDA care centers have the same model, and all multidisciplinary clinics should be able to direct you to research centers where enrollment is possible for you. It is best for everyone that we work together, and research is the way for us to do this in order to beat ALS. Next slide, please. So things to think about before looking for a trial. What is most important to you when you think about getting involved in research? What do you expect to get out of participating in a trial? Next slide, please. So now that you've gone through your little mental checklist and you still want to participate in research, possibly the first place you will turn to look for trials is clinicaltrials.gov. It's one of the biggest resources for all research. There are also some ALS-specific resources like NEALS.org and many other groups that maintain their own websites, like the MDA and large ALS research centers also list their trials and contact information on their own websites. So on clinicaltrials.gov on July 2nd, the number of ALS trials was 787, but not really. Of these 787 trials, 143 are listed as recruiting and 33 are not recruiting yet. So you may have 176 possible options. This is a very large number, and I would imagine quite overwhelming. So what do you do next? You want to think about whether you would like to participate in observational studies, which have fewer visits and less criteria. And while you do not receive direct benefit from these studies, you do make a big contribution to science. Your participation may help researchers discover ways to diagnose ALS sooner, or may lead to drug trials for others to participate in. Or do you want to participate in an investigational medication trial in order to get access to that experimental drug while contributing significantly to ALS research? Next slide, please. So how do you learn about trials? Now you know there seems to be many trials that may be available for you after looking on clinicaltrials.gov and other research sites, and you might feel a little overwhelmed. What do you do next to learn about trials? First, you probably want to gain a general understanding of ALS research. You can do this by researching online, talking to your ALS provider and nurse, and contacting known ALS research centers. This will help you understand what the researchers expect for outcomes in the different phases of a trial and why these drugs were selected to be investigated for ALS. It may also be appropriate for you to seek out the help of a family member or a friend who loves to research. If you talk to your clinical team and they don't conduct research trials, you could ask for them to connect you with some research centers. You may reach out to these centers directly. Many have websites with contact information and trials listed, and you can join online groups of people living with ALS who are interested in research and are very willing to share their knowledge. Once you feel like you have a little bit of an understanding of ALS research, you and your team can start to look at different trials that may be a fit for you. Next slide, please. So how to select a trial? It might be a good idea to initially focus on a few trials that are of interest to you. Ask yourself what interests you about these trials. Do you like the science behind them? Is the phase of the trial important to you? Do you prefer trials that are open label, where everyone gets the drug, or open label extension, where everyone has the opportunity to get the study drug after completing the trial? Do you like shorter trials or long trials? Do you like trials with just a few visits? Do you want to participate in trials at research centers that are geographically accessible to you? So once you have identified a few trials of interest, to help figure out if you might meet the criteria, you can review the general criteria listed on clinicaltrials.gov or neals.org. Knowing whether you meet some of the criteria helps you to focus in on trials that you may be eligible for. And then you can talk to your provider about these trials to get his or her input. You can also reach out to the centers, the research centers listed on clinicaltrials.gov that are conducting the trials that you are interested in. Or if contact information for the pharmaceutical company is included in the listing, you can reach out to the company to find out if there are any research centers near you that will be enrolling in the trial and obtain the contact information. Then you can call the research centers and talk to them about what their enrollment process is. I do want to share that I have seen an uptick of interest in trials, in participating in trials over the past 6 to 8 months. So if you are interested in a few trials and you get offered a screening spot in one, but haven't heard from the other trial team, you may want to think about accepting that first screening spot. Or you can take a chance and hope for a screening spot in the second trial. So at this point, I think it's a good moment for you to pause and talk to your ALS provider and team. Next slide, please. So whatever you decide to do with research, I want to thank you for attending this webinar and asking us about research, for talking about research, for thinking about participating in a trial, and for sharing what you have learned about research with others living with ALS. And for those of you who have already participated in research, whether it be an interventional drug trial or an observational study, I want to thank you, because every tube of blood truly does help us. We are so grateful to you, because through your participation, researchers can continue to make new discoveries that lead us closer to all of the answers that we need to solve ALS for everyone. Thank you so much for listening to me today.
Thank you, Judy. Now, I would like to introduce our remaining 2 speakers. Paul Melmeyer currently serves as the Director of Regulatory Affairs at the Muscular Dystrophy Association. In this role, Paul leads MDA policy and advocacy initiatives pertaining to therapeutic development with a particular focus on regulatory efforts. Prior to joining MDA, Paul spent over 6 years with the National Organization for Rare Disorders. At NORD, Paul led the federal policy operations in developing and advocating for the enactment and implementation of pro-rare disease patient policy. Paul also holds a Master of Public Policy from George Washington University. Paul is constantly seeking opportunities to make a difference in the lives of the less fortunate through compassionate and effective policy change. Bruce Rosenblum was diagnosed with ALS in August of 2017 at the age of 58. Since his diagnosis, he has participated in 2 clinical trials and more than half a dozen research studies. Bruce is passionate about participating in research in the hope that it will lead to better understanding of ALS and a cure for this disease. He continues to work full-time at Adapon Systems, where he is the VP of Content and Workflow Solutions. Bruce has 2 grown sons and lives with his wife Irina in Somerville, Massachusetts. And with that, I would like to turn over the webinar to Paul.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for the introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here today with everybody talking about ALS and our advocacy work. So we can move to the next slide. I just want to give a little bit of a background on MDA's advocacy work before I get into some of the specifics of our work on clinical trials as they pertain to ALS. So we have a small but mighty advocacy team here at the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and what we focus on are really these kind of general priorities. The first is access to care and therapies from day one, and what this means is doing everything we can through policymaking to ensure that the neuromuscular disease population is receiving the very best and affordable care possible, both when it comes to therapies, as well as clinicians, as well as diagnoses, and many other facets of quality, accessible healthcare. The second is accelerating therapeutic development, which we'll be talking mostly about today, and this means getting more and better therapies to the neuromuscular disease community quicker. And then finally, empowerment and independence, and this is advocacy on issues pertaining to employment and accessibility and air travel and other matters that are also important for daily living for the neuromuscular disease patient community. So to move to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about our viewpoints of ALS clinical trials. Now, of course, ALS clinical trials are very heterogeneous, very different as you look at the trial parameters from one to another. But we have witnessed certain trends, especially as they pertain to later stage clinical trials or phase 3 clinical trials, as Dr. Paganoni already described earlier in the presentation. And what we've seen within ALS is that oftentimes the clinical trials are rarely employing some of the more advanced progressive structures that we've seen in other disease areas, even within neuromuscular diseases for that matter. We've seen trials for Duchenne muscular dystrophy or spinal muscular atrophy feature some very progressive and innovative structures that we just haven't seen utilized within ALS quite yet. And there's even further differences between what we've seen in some cancer clinical trials compared to what we're seeing within ALS. And what we're seeing within ALS is concerning. We still see the wide use of placebos, oftentimes the ratio of experimental therapy to placebo being 2 to 1, maybe even 1 to 1, meaning that in a clinical trial, half the individuals get the placebo, half the individuals get the experimental therapy. We're also seeing not nearly enough of the utilization of expanded access and open label extensions. And what that means, I'll start with open label extensions, is for individuals who are within the clinical trial, no matter what group they're in, whether they're in the experimental or the placebo group, following the conclusion of their participation in the trial, they get to obtain the experimental therapy. They either stay on the experimental therapy if they were in that group, or if they were in the placebo group, they get to start the experimental therapy for a given amount of time, perhaps all the way until the therapy may be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Expanded access is for individuals who weren't allowed to participate within the clinical trial due to one reason or the other. And actually, this is oftentimes due to the next item here, which is narrow inclusion criteria. And this means that only a certain subset of the ALS community is actually allowed to participate within any given clinical trial. Maybe individuals with only certain mobility abilities or with certain breathing abilities. Perhaps individuals could be considered to have progressed too far in the disease, maybe not even progressed far enough in the disease to participate within a clinical trial. And so it inherently limits the number of individuals and the experiences of individuals who can actually participate in that clinical trial. Oftentimes, there might be a small number of trial sites set up for a specific trial. And then finally, oftentimes there can be dissatisfactory endpoints or clinical outcome assessments used within the clinical trial. And what that means is that the endpoint for a given clinical trial might not be the most meaningful endpoint that the patient community would like. Let's say, the ALS community may want certain endpoints pertaining to mobility or to breathing prioritized within a clinical trial, but instead the endpoint chosen is not what specifically the ALS community wants the drug to be measured by. And so it might not be quite as meaningful as the endpoint could be for that reason. So we're still seeing this occur within ALS, and we know it doesn't have to be this way, we can accelerate the progression moving away from some of these problematic features. So to move to the next slide, what we are advocating more vociferously is an end to some of these practices that are problematic, and the utilization of some of the practices that are beneficial for the ALS community. We want to see more open label extensions included within ALS clinical trials. We want to see expanded access more widely used within ALS clinical trials, because that means that individuals who didn't qualify for the clinical trial, perhaps because the inclusion criteria was too narrow, that now they still can access the investigational therapy. And we want to see as quickly as we can and move away from placebos. We know it's not going to happen overnight, but we do hope that placebos can be used less and less within clinical trials in ALS. And actually, the HEALEY platform trial is a perfect example of what we do want to see, because within that trial, we can have a much smaller exposure to placebo because there are that many more experimental therapies that are included within the platform clinical trial that allows for individuals who are signing up for that platform trial to have a greater likelihood of actually accessing the experimental therapy rather than being placed on a placebo. So ways in which we can move away from placebos within ALS clinical trials is also something we want to see. So to move to the next slide, the next steps that we're going to be taking with these goals in mind is we're going to be looking for innovative policy solutions to address these challenges, both in trying to get more expanded access programs and open label extensions set up within ALS clinical trials, as well as a greater set of inclusion criterion included within ALS clinical trials, as well as fewer uses of placebos. We're going to be working with FDA on these goals, as well as FDA, of course, has a role to play in encouraging clinical trial sponsors to actually use expanded access programs and open label extensions. And of course, FDA has to sign off on any clinical trial structure that the trial sponsors propose to FDA. And then, of course, we're going to be encouraging companies to utilize these innovative mechanisms. And the final piece of this puzzle, in a sense, is congressional advocacy for laws that lower the barriers of employing these programs, expanded access programs and open label extensions, as well as other ways in which we can encourage true innovation within ALS clinical trials. So to move to the next slide, I wanted to say just a few words on what's happening on Capitol Hill right now. And there actually are two bills that have really been led by the ALS community that are very related to these goals. And we did issue a statement on these goals. I know you can't click this URL right here, but if you go to our advocacy site, which is our cqrengage.com/MDA, you'll be able to find this statement quite quickly. It was published back in mid-June. And it is on two bills, the Act for ALS and Promising Pathways Act. Now, the Act for ALS, it tries to tackle one of the issues that we're seeing, which is not nearly as much utilization of expanded access programs as there should be. So it actually sets up a fund at the NIH and FDA for government funding to go towards expanded access programs, not only within ALS, but within other serious neurological conditions as well. The bill also creates a center of excellence at FDA. And these are all things that we're very encouraged by. As policymaking goes, there are little nitty-gritty technical things here or there that we're still working on to ensure that the bill is going to work as best as it can. But nonetheless, this bill is trying to address exactly what we're seeing as an issue, especially when it comes to expanded access programs. The second bill is the Promising Pathway Act, and actually there's a House version now. You see a Senate Bill 3872 there, but there's also a House version that I did not add to the slide here, but there's a companion over in the House of Representatives. And what this bill does is it sets up a new regulatory pathway that allows for provisional approval of therapies before they have reached full approval from the FDA. And this would ostensibly then increase access to investigational therapies as they're still making their way through clinical trial process. Now, as you can imagine, setting up a brand new regulatory pathway to FDA is very complicated. So we're working with those on Capitol Hill who are putting this bill together to be sure that whatever is the final version of the bill, that it's going to be the very best bill possible, that it thinks of everything, it looks under every rock and foresees any way in which this pathway could be beneficial to the ALS community. One final slide, and that is on just other things that we're doing on Capitol Hill that pertains to those with ALS. And this isn't exactly clinical trial specific, so I'm going a little bit off script here. But there's a lot of other things the advocacy department at MDA is tackling. And one is to eliminate the 5-month waiting period for SSDI for the ALS community. And we're working very closely with our partners in the ALS space, including the ALS Association, IMALS, and others on this effort. We're, of course, support efforts to increase the NIH budget, particularly as it pertains to ALS research. We're fighting efforts to weaken access to health insurance, both private and public. And that includes pre-existing condition protections to ensure that the ALS community is able to obtain adequate and affordable health insurance. We're looking for ways to increase access to genetic counselors in the Medicare program. And then finally, we're also supporting legislation that further incentivizes employers to hire individuals with disabilities. And that's not even an exhaustive list. There's more we're doing up there. But in only 10 minutes, I had to get through as much as I possibly could. So my final slide is just a big thank you. Thank you for listening to me today as I'm talking about what we're doing in MDA's advocacy department. You can also find us on Twitter at MDA_advocacy. You can email us at advocacy@mdausa.org. You can email me at pmelmeyer@mdausa.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. I would now like to move to our final speaker of the day, Bruce Rosenblum.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. Michelle asked me to start out by talking a little bit about my journey to diagnosis, and then my journey through clinical trials. And my journey started just over 3 years ago when I was headed into an annual physical with my primary care physician, someone I'd been working with for 25 years. And unlike previous years, I felt that something just wasn't quite right. And in a world of managed care and 15-minute appointments, I thought, I don't want to spend 14 and a half minutes trying to just describe to him off the top of my head all the things that don't feel quite right. So I sent him an email the night before the physical. And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to read from pieces of this email because I think it's helpful. Hi, Dr. K. To save some time when you see me tomorrow, I thought I'd send a short note with some background on my health since my last physical. The past 12 months have been very stressful. My father-in-law died last June after a 6-month battle with stomach cancer. 3 days after he died, the father of one of my closest friends died. 2 days later, we started my father on hospice. My father died in mid-September, 3 months after that, of cardiovascular failure and dementia, 3 months shy of his 95th birthday. He had been declining for 3 years. We had 3 major technical crises at work, all of which were successfully resolved, but significantly added to my stress. And then the first half of this year, I've continued to be very busy at work, traveling every other week since the beginning of April. At my previous physical, I described cramping problems in my legs. Those cramps still are occurring, but not quite as frequently. But since last fall, I've been having balance problems with my left foot, and these problems are becoming increasingly troublesome. I have to go more slowly up and down stairs, and I can't walk as fast as I used to. I have trouble keeping balanced when carrying heavy things like a box of firewood up the steps to our house. I lost my balance and fell twice recently when trying to carry a kayak out of the water. I've lost my balance and fallen several times in the past 9 months when walking our dog, and he pulled in an unexpected manner. My only regular exercise is walking our dog 2 to 3 times a day. I cross-country skied several times last winter, but the balance problems made it less fun than before because I feel quite unstable going down even gentle slopes. Overall, I feel like I'm coming into this year's appointment much less limber than at any time in the past. Putting on socks is harder than it used to be, and in some ways, not quite as strong as I used to be. I can still put a full case up in the overhead storage bin with a little more effort, but I can still lift a 40-pound box of firewood. See you tomorrow morning, Bruce. So I got into my physical the next morning, and the first thing my doctor did without even saying a word is he came over and he gave me a hug, which was very out of character, at least as I perceived it. And then I thought that was because my father had died 9 months earlier. So he proceeded with the physical, and at one point in the physical, he said, now let me check something here. And he did what I now recognize was a neurological exam. That is, he tested my arm strength and my leg strength. And it was suddenly clear just from him doing that there was something wrong with my left leg and my left arm. Not profoundly wrong, but enough that it was noticeable. So, he's completely calm through all this. And he said, you know what, let's run some tests. Let's start out with an MRI. We'll get that done within 48 hours. So he arranged the MRI stat, had it done, came up negative. And by this point, we're going back and forth in email. I said, okay, I want to run another test called an EMG. Some people find it a little bit painful. They're going to stick a bunch of needles into you, but I think it's the next thing we should do. So I figure, okay, fine. Go get the EMG. 3 weeks later, I have the appointment. I get the EMG. Halfway through or near the end of the appointment, the doctor looks at me and says, I'd like to run a few additional tests, but I have another appointment right now. Can you hang for another 45 minutes and come back? I said, sure, I've got my laptop with me. I'll just sit in your waiting room, get some work done. She spent another 45 minutes with me. So essentially 2 appointments in one day. A few days later, I get an email from my primary care saying, you know, Bruce, I think you should come in so we can talk. And again, completely calm through all this. He calls me and he did not speculate as to what was going on. All he said is, you know, I think I want to run a few more tests. I want to get another MRI and I want to get a muscle biopsy. And I think you should probably see a neuromuscular specialist. Actually, I think you should see 2. Now, you may consider me naive, but at this point, the alarm bells still were not going off in my head. I figure, you know, it's a muscle problem. Maybe it's related to stress. They'll give me a pill. Maybe it's something that requires physical therapy or surgery, but I'll be fine. So I had the second MRI. That came up negative. I had the muscle biopsy, didn't get results. And in the meantime, I ended up connecting with the ALS clinic, or I should say the neurology department, because at that point I had no idea what it might be. The neurology department at Leahy Hospital in Boston, or just outside of Boston, and then with MGH. So I had appointments set up at both places. And so 3 years, almost to the day, and exactly 2 months to the day after that physical, where I went in with this note the night before, I went to Leahy and met with the neurologist, and he had me change into the gown, did the exam, asked me to get dressed, came back into the room, sat down on one of those little round chairs with the wheels, came up about this far away from my face, about a foot away, looked me straight in the eye and said, do you have any idea what's going on? And I said, no, none at all. He said, this is going to be a really hard conversation. I think you have ALS. And that for me was the moment that the floor sort of dropped out from underneath me. I had absolutely no idea what was coming. So he spent gratefully 2 hours with me and my wife that afternoon, answered every question that we could think of, told us about what was available for medications, told me what I should do in terms of exercise and diet, was really incredibly, incredibly helpful. Most importantly, did not rush us out of there. That was hard news to absorb. And I didn't even begin to absorb it immediately. And a week later, I went to MGH, where both Judy and Dr. Paganoni are. And I met with Dr. Reda, who is still my neurologist at MGH. And he did the same exam, asked me to get dressed, came back into the room. And this time, instead of asking if I understood what was going on, he said, have you seen any other neurologists? I said, yeah, I saw Dr. Russell up at Leahy last week. And his body language changed instantly because he realized he wasn't going to be the doctor to deliver the bad news to me. And knowing what I know now, I don't wish delivering that news on any physician at all. And in fact, that's one of the challenges with ALS, is such a horrible diagnosis. I mean, I hate to use that word, but that's what it is, that a lot of physicians are really scared of delivering that news. Interestingly, I went back, so I stayed at MGH, so I've only seen Dr. Russell, the doctor who diagnosed me the one time. And I actually switched primary care physicians about 6 weeks after I was diagnosed. Not that I disliked my existing physician, but I wanted to change to one who people in my family knew, because I realized they would need his help as much as I would. And so I actually haven't seen my primary care since that appointment when he recommended the EMG, and I haven't seen Dr. Russell since. But I went back to both of them last fall and I said, you guys both did an amazing job by me. In that, what I mean is my primary care physician didn't speculate on what was going wrong. He ran all the right tests. I've actually told a number of neurologists that I work with now at MGH that I had an EMG done at the recommendation of my primary care, and they all looked at me completely stunned. They said, that's amazing. Normally what happens is your primary care will refer you to a neurologist. You wait 2 months for that appointment. They recommended EMG. You wait 2 months for that appointment. And that's part of why the typical time to diagnosis with ALS, the average time is 11 months. I consider myself lucky. I was diagnosed in 2 months flat. And what that meant is I had that much more time to do things while I could still be physically active. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the fact both that my primary care didn't speculate on what might be going on, and also that I didn't go to the internet and try to figure out myself, because I think if I'd had any inkling it was ALS, I would have been absolutely terrified. I'm also grateful to Dr. Russell for having spent 2 hours with me that day, because I've heard too many stories where people were diagnosed in a 15-minute appointment that boiled down to, you have ALS, there's not much we can do, get your affairs in order. And that, in my mind, is just criminal. It's cruel to treat someone like that, delivering that kind of a diagnosis. As it was, I was really in a state of shock. It took me 2 months after diagnosis before I even decided I was going to start riluzole. It took me 2 months to even begin to absorb what was going on. But even in those first 2 months, things did start to happen. So at that appointment that I had at MGH a week after I was diagnosed, one of the people who they had me meet with, it was a 4-hour appointment, met with the neurologist, I met with someone from the physical therapy team, and I met with Judy. And Judy, as I recall, and my memory, again, from this time period is pretty thin because I was in such a state of shock, but I recall Judy spending probably the better part of an hour with my wife and myself. And she was starting to explain to us what clinical trials might be available. And I now look back and realize that even though I wasn't ready to make any decisions, that was incredibly helpful time. And she described to me a number of trials, including one that involved a number of spinal taps. And my first reaction is, oh my God, that sounds dangerous. I'd never had a spinal tap. No one in my family's ever had one. And that was when I actually turned to a friend of mine who's a physician after that appointment and said, you know, they've offered me this clinical trial and it sounds really interesting, but it's got spinal taps. He said, don't worry. I'm sure the neurology department there, they do tons of spinal taps because it's just part of research in that area. And that helped allay my fears around that. And that was really, really helpful. So one thing I recommend to people is if you're considering clinical trials, if you have friends who are physicians and you're just not sure about things, certainly run things past them because that can be very helpful input. Anyhow, I went back to my next appointment at MGH 3 months after I was diagnosed, met again with Judy during that appointment and said, you know, I think I'm ready to go ahead with the clinical trial. And she said, well, I have some bad news for you. The one that you're interested in is on hold. I thought, uh-oh, this doesn't sound really good. And I pressed on it. And I feel sorry for Judy because, you know, I was new to this and I just didn't quite understand how everything worked. And she said, you know, I understand where you're coming from. It's my job to advocate for you. And so that's something else to think about when you're engaging with your care team, is you want people who will engage with you and who will advocate for you. And if you're not finding that, reach out to places like the MDA Association. I believe Judy does work with people who are outside of the MGH community. Reach out to people who you can talk with and who can help you advocate for yourself if you don't feel like you're being listened to. But Judy heard me. She heard that I was interested in this trial. And 2 months later, I got a call one day saying, hey, Bruce, guess what? We're opening up this trial. Would you like to come in and pre-screen? And I said, you bet I would like to. And so I went in 2 days later, pre-screened, ended up being accepted into the trial. And this trial was 11 months long. It involved 14 visits to MGH in 11 months, including 3 overnight visits. And it turned out over that time, I got to know the team at MGH incredibly well because I spent a lot of time with them. And for me, one of the critical turning points, and let me actually rewind for a second. Why did I want to get into this trial? There were a couple of reasons, but I'll be very blunt. The initial reason I wanted to get into this trial is I looked with Judy's help and with the help of my friend at everything that was currently in the pipeline available for clinical trials. I said, I can sit here and I can take riluzole and do nothing more, or I can get involved in a clinical trial that might actually help me. You know, I might get on the lucky side of a good clinical trial. And as one person who was involved in a clinical trial said a few years ago, I have a choice. I can go into a placebo-controlled trial and have a 50-50 chance of doing something that might help me, or I can do nothing. And I'll take 50-50 any day over 0. So that was why I was interested in going into this. It was certainly very much all about me. But partway through that trial, I came in one day for just a routine checkup, And I was having a bad day, and the neurologist I worked with on this trial, Dr. Nicholson, sensed I was having a bad day, and she just set aside the papers and she listened to me for 20 or 25 minutes. And that was a gift, because I walked out of that visit feeling so much better, and I realized, wait a second, I'm dealing with a team that realizes people with ALS are struggling and they care. And they care enough to sit down and show empathy and listen to me when I'm not having a good day. And that really changed my head, because I realized, wait a second, I'm involved in something much bigger than just myself on this. I'm involved in science, and I'm involved in science that can impact a lot of other people. So when I was in for the 13th of 14 appointments, I turned to Dr. Nicholson. She was doing a spinal tap that afternoon at one point. And I said, you know, this has been just an incredibly gratifying experience for me, not just being involved in the trial, but working with all of you as a team. How can I stay involved? So she started rattling off a number of other studies that were in the works. There was nothing in the way of trials that I could participate in at that point. Studies, just to be clear, are observational. I'm not taking a therapy, but I'm involved in work where things can be learned from me, whether it's biomarkers, giving blood, whether it's digital measurement, understanding how my symptoms are progressing. So Dr. Nicholson said, well, you know, I've got this, we've got that, and, you know, we've got this study. It's a skin biopsy, there's a blood draw, and there's an optional spinal tap. But hey, you've just had 7 spinal taps on this other trial. You're not going to want to do another spinal tap. And I just looked and said, wait a second. I've had such an amazing experience working with you on this trial that if you're going to do the spinal tap, I will come in. I don't care about doing an 8th spinal tap, and I understand it's voluntary. This is now about science. And what was really cool is actually about 3 weeks before that spinal tap, it was a 3-month delay before I got in for it. About 3 weeks before that, my mother actually picked up on an article that had just been published in Nature Neuroscience about some science around something called STEM2. And I looked at that article, looked at what they were talking about in it, and suddenly realized, wait a second, this is the stuff that they're doing with this, with the CSF from this spinal tap. And so I went in, I turned to Dr. Nicholson and said, hey, is this connected to that Nature Neuroscience article? And she said, you bet it is. I said, I'm super excited now, because I can now see a direct line from how I can contribute as a patient to what researchers are learning. And so ever since then, for me, this has been all about what can I do in terms of helping out with research? How can I pay it forward so that other people with ALS can have the benefit of anything that researchers can learn from my body? So this has been what's really driving me into clinical trials ever since, and also research. As Michelle said in the introduction, I've done, I think I counted the other day, and it's now 9 studies. And I've now just 2 months ago started in my 2nd clinical trial, in a trial for a compound called IC14. It's actually, in this case, expanded access, so it's available on what's called compassionate use. So I'm actually getting the treatment in this case. I will tell you that over the last 1.5 years since I'd finished up my first trial, I was really, really disappointed that I couldn't participate in more trials, because again, for me at this point, it's about the science, it's about contributing. And so I was thrilled when this opportunity opened up that I've been able to do this. And I look forward now, I'm going into MGH every 2 weeks for a 2-hour infusion. I look forward to those visits, not just for the hope that, yes, maybe IC14 can do something for me, but in addition with the knowledge that ultimately my participation may help others in the future. And ultimately, and I'll close on this note, and then maybe we can open it up to questions, either Michelle, questions for me, or questions from the audience. My key driver above all else right now is I see what I'm going through, and I'm incredibly fortunate in so many ways. I live in one of the most amazing medical areas in the world. I'm in the Boston area. I have an amazing both clinical and research team that I work with at MGH. I'm incredibly lucky that 3 years in, I can still speak, and most people, if they don't see me and see my physical limitations, they have no idea that I have ALS. But it does take a toll on me, no question about that. And I have my bad days, and more importantly, it takes a toll on my family. And so the key driver for me in research and in advocacy is if I can help in any small way so that researchers can find an answer even one day sooner, so that even one patient and one patient's family do not have to go through what I'm going through and what my family's going through. It is worth absolutely every minute that I put into being involved in research. So that's my story, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing your story. We really appreciate it. I'd like to now turn over the webinar for any questions. If you hover over towards the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to click on the Q&A function. We already have a few questions in. The first one is there an age limit to participate in a clinical trial?
Perhaps I can take this. So most ALS trials are for people 18 or older, so adults. Some trials do have an upper limit, but many don't. So for example, for the HEALEY ALS platform trial, we don't have an upper limit of age. So as long as you are 18 or older, you can participate in terms of age range.
Here's another question that you might be able to answer, Dr. Paganoni, is can we leverage some of the same streamlined trial processes for COVID for ALS trials?
That's a great question, and actually we've been working on it for the last few months, specifically for the HEALEY ALS platform trial. We were about to launch in March and start enrolling participants in March, and exactly when the first cases of COVID happened in the US. So that's why we had to sort of take a step back and sort of rethink some of our processes. And so we spent the last 3 or 4 months doing exactly that, trying to leverage things that had been put in place and become more common in the context of the pandemic. So for example, we're going to allow some visits to be done by telemedicine if needed because of the pandemic. We're going to allow we're still working on making this possible, because obviously there's some logistical things that have to be put in place, but we're going to allow people to do their vital capacity at home over the next few months, again, leveraging digital technologies and smartphone technologies that can be used for remote monitoring. So yes, a lot of the things that happened because of COVID, I mean, I guess if we can find a positive aspect to that, you know, we can leverage more of the virtual remote telemedicine technologies, and we are actually using them for many of the upcoming trials.
We have another question about the HEALEY platform, and it is, when are the trials moving forward with screening, if there's a date for that?
Right, so we are actually working actively on that. So I would ask you that, you know, let's keep in touch over the next few days and couple of weeks. We are hoping to open as many sites as possible at the same time. So again, feel free to reach out at the central number, the patient navigator I shared earlier. And I think this webinar will be shared and, you know, was recorded and will be shared. So if not, you can always email me. You can find me on our website, my email, and we can share. You know, and Judy's address is also on our website, so you can contact us, and again, we'll keep you posted with news as they become available.
Yes. One last question on the HEALEY platforms, and that is, do you have to be seen at MGH in order to be part of the platform trial?
No, and first of all, I just want to say that this webinar was so fantastic, and I especially appreciate everyone's perspectives, and especially Bruce's story, and there really sheds light on many important points, and also everything that Paul said. You know, again, those are all things that we're working on, and we hope that the HEALEY ALS platform trial will exactly address those limitations of previous trials. One of them being the limited availability geographically. So what we are doing with the trial, and also other trials are trying to do that as well, is to be open at as many centers as possible, so that we can be as close as possible to where people live. So for this particular trial, the platform trial, we're going to be opening 54 centers, and actually we hope to expand to even more centers in the future. So, you know, you don't have to be at MGH by any means. Actually, the trial will be enrolling at 54 centers, and for clarification, the trial is exactly the same at any center. And the good news is that every treatment that we test in the trial, so we're going to start with 3, we're going to add the 4th in the fall, and then again more in 2021. Every trial will be available at every center. So in other words, it will equalize the access opportunities across different centers.
If I can just jump in here for a second, as a patient, I think there are a lot of things that are really, really exciting about the platform trial. One is it really tries to cut down on the number of people who are on placebo and boost the number of people who are on therapies. And that's really exciting. The second is I'm really excited that Dr. Paganoni and her team have worked really hard to minimize the exclusion criteria so as many people can be involved as possible. And the third thing is the point that Dr. Paganoni just made about 54 centers. I think it's great that it's so widely available. I know that I am blessed, and every time I say that I'm blessed or I'm fortunate, that is obviously in the context that, yes, a diagnosis of ALS sucks. But within that, I'm blessed because I'm so close to MGH, I can easily get in. But I know for a lot of people, especially as you lose strength, if you're an ALS patient, it is tougher and tougher to get to a center. And so I'm really excited by the fact that it's going to be available at 54 centers.
Thanks, Bruce. We actually have a few questions for you as well. You're being called on inspiration, and they're asking what trial you're in.
So the current trial that I'm in is called IC14. It's an expanded access trial. If you were to go onto clinicaltrials.gov, and I realize that's not always the most patient-friendly site, but search for ALS and IC14, you'll find just a few trials around that, and this is the one that is listed as expanded access. The other thing that's actually really exciting in many ways about IC14 is that it's also in a clinical trial right now in Europe for severe cases of COVID. So it's actually a compound for which they think there might be multiple really interesting uses. So given the current news environment, that makes it especially exciting for me to be involved with it. The earlier trial that I was in was Brainstorm. Some people know that as Neurone, which is the name of the treatment for that. And that I was in 2018. So my involvement ended in that a year and a half ago.
Here's another question. Can someone explain more about expanded access programs and how ALS patients can locate and participate in them?
Yeah, I can start, and maybe others can also weigh in. If you can go back to that slide, actually, so that people can have time to look at the website and contact information, the slide that you had on before with Judy's contact and our website. That's the place to connect with if you want to get information about the HEALEY ALS platform trial. So if you sign up for this newsletter, you can get information about the trial. So please do sign up, and you'll get to hear from Judy about our news when they come out over the next few days and weeks. And then the other thing is we're also working hard on expanded access options. And news about that will also be circulated on the link and on our website. So essentially expanded access means that we are also creating, in collaboration with others, and other groups can do that as well, we are creating a way for people who do not qualify for clinical trials to still contribute to research and get access to an experimental treatment by enrolling in an expanded access program, like Bruce said. Is participating in an expanded access program. There's certainly a lot of interest and a lot of desire to create more. It's not going to happen overnight, but I want to ensure you that a lot of us are working on it in collaboration with many groups, nonprofits, patient advocacy groups, many collaborators. There's companies that are interested in that. So again, more more to come on this. That's certainly one of our priorities, and we will continue to update the website about new programs. Right now, there's only a few that are available. I would suggest that you start talking with your neurologist or ALS care team just to get some information. And obviously, look online. Again, you can always email us at the links here for more information. Again, they're not just at MGH, they can be at other centers as well.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to what Dr. Paganoni said there. There's a couple resources out there that could be helpful in finding expanded access programs. One is clinicaltrials.gov itself, which Bruce referenced. And actually, I'm going to, in the chat, paste a URL there, which is goes directly towards expanded access programs for ALS therapies. You'll see that there are 6 on there, only one of which is available, actively open right now for individuals to sign up. You'll also see Bruce's on there, which is unfortunately closed, it appears, at the moment. But nonetheless, this is a link that should capture all expanded access programs that are currently running at this point, whether they're open or not, to look at. The other resource, I want to just give a quick shout out to our friends over at IMALS. They put together a great ALS signal program, which also captures expanded access programs as well as other clinical trials for ALS. So 2 good resources to check out. And Dr. Paganoni, sounds like you wanted to weigh in again.
Thank you. Yes, no, I wanted to say that, the clinicaltrials.gov is, as you may know, is a government-run website for all clinical trials, not just for ALS. That's why it can be a little bit difficult to access because, again, it lists clinical trials for everything, really, not just for ALS. So you kind of have to narrow your criteria when you search, and it can be a little bit overwhelming, I would admit. So the one thing that's different about expanded access is that the clinical trial registration responsibilities are a little bit different. So I just want to warn the audience that some expanded access programs may not be listed there because it depends on how they are set up and whether they fit criteria for being listed there. So just a word of caution, it's still a very fluid and evolving landscape. Again, I'm seriously hoping that this field will continue to grow and expand, and it's going to be easier to access. And there's many of us, including patient groups such as IMALS, obviously working on that and championing this field in collaboration with other groups as well. So I would suggest that, again, you continue to talk to your neurologist and ALS care team to find the program that might be best for you.
Thank you. And just as a reminder, we will be sending out an email tomorrow with all of the information and contacts shared on the presentation today. I think that might be all of the questions we have. The next slide, please. Before we wrap up, I wanted to make sure that you are aware that we will be having more presentations around a variety of topics specific to ALS during our MDA Engage ALS Symposium taking place on September 15th and 16th. Laura Clausen from Johns Hopkins is our event chair. This will be a virtual event as well, and I would encourage you to visit mda.org/engage/ALS20 for details and to register. We'll also include that on the email as well. Also, thank you again to our event sponsors, Biogen and Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma America. We would not be able to provide events like this if not for your generous support, so thank you very much. If anyone does have questions after this webinar, please feel free to email them to mdaengaged@mdausa.org, and we will follow back up with you. This concludes today's MDA Engage webinar, Clinical Trials in the ALS Community. I'd like to say thank you very much to our speakers, Dr. Paganoni, Judy Carey, Paul Melmeyer, and Bruce Rosenblum. Thank you very much for attending, and have a great rest of your day.